The door to the basement always made the same sound. It was a long, aching creak that seemed to come from deep inside the wood, a sound that could have been harmless in any other house. But in ours, it was the sound that made my chest tighten and my breath come shallow. Even now, decades later, I can still hear it as clearly as the ticking clock in the kitchen upstairs. That creak was not just a noise, it was a warning. The air would change after it, growing heavy, thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, life went on like nothing was wrong. The sun would shine, children would ride their bikes on the smooth pavement, neighbors would wave while mowing their lawns. The smell of apple pie would drift from someone's kitchen, mixing with the cut grass and warm asphalt. Our street in Pennsylvania looked like something out of a postcard, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted the man next door to water their plants. From the outside, my home fit perfectly into that picture. But inside, the silence was not peace. It was obedience. It was the unspoken rule that kept the truth buried. I remember the way the light fell through the front window in the late afternoons, casting long rectangles across the living room floor. That same light could never reach the basement stairs. They were always dark, even on the brightest summer days. My feet knew the feel of those steps by heart. The first one always groaned under the weight. The third one was slightly loose, and the seventh one had a thin layer of dust, no matter how often it was swept. I knew them because I had walked them too many times. My hand pressed hard into the splintered wood of the railing, trying to steady my shaking legs. No one ever talked about the basement. It was just there, like the old shed in the backyard or the attic we never opened. My mother pretended it was for storage. Boxes of Christmas decorations, a broken rocking chair, tools my father never used. That was the story. But in reality, it was a place that carried the smell of damp concrete and oil, a place where the air was cold even in July. I hated that smell. I hated the way it clung to my clothes and hair, as if it wanted to remind me where I had been. The first few seconds after the door opened were always the same. The faint light from the kitchen would spill into the dark, stretching across the top steps like hesitant fingers. I would hear the sound of breathing, not mine, slow, steady, waiting. It was the kind of breathing that filled every space between the creaks and the shadows. My skin would prickle before I even took the first step down. I was a quiet child, the kind who didn't cause trouble, who sat still at church and never interrupted adults. People liked to say I was well behaved. In truth, I had already learned that making noise was dangerous. I had already learned that speaking out could bring worse things than silence. My mother used to tell me when I was very small that children who stayed quiet were easier to love. It took me years to realize she wasn't talking about love at all. She was talking about control. On those afternoons when the sound of the basement door cut through the air, the world seemed to split in two. Upstairs was the safe part, the part where the refrigerator hummed and the smell of laundry soap drifted from the washer. Downstairs was something else entirely. It was where voices lowered and eyes hardened, where time stretched until it felt like it might never end. My heart would pound so hard, I could feel it in my throat. But my steps would keep moving because stopping wasn't an option. There were days when I would try to hold onto the upstairs world for as long as I could. I would stare at the sunlight on the carpet, memorize the pattern in the fabric of the couch, count the flowers and the wallpaper by the kitchen table. It was my way of reminding myself that something good existed, even if it wasn't mine in that moment. But the door would always open, the creak would always come, and the cold air from below would reach up like a hand around my ankle, pulling me back into the dark. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel that air. I can smell it. I can hear the faint hum of the old freezer down there, the one that rattled just enough to make the silence seem alive. And I remember the way my body would start to shake, not from the cold, but from knowing that once I stepped past that first stair, no one upstairs would hear me anymore. No one would know, or maybe they did know. Maybe they just didn't want to. The basement was not a place you escaped from in one piece. It was a place you survived in fragments. I learned to store those fragments in the quiet corners of my mind. to tuck them away behind locked doors. But the sound that unlocked them, the creak of that basement door, has never left me. It was the sound of my world closing in, of the safe parts fading into shadows. It was the sound that told me I was alone, even in a house full of people. My name is Helena Mora. I am 72 years old now, and I live in a small town in the heart of Pennsylvania. It is the kind of place where people greet each other at the grocery store and remember the names of your grandchildren even if you only spoke once. My house is modest, with a front porch where I keep a rocking chair that creaks softly in the evenings. I spend my mornings sewing in a sunlit corner of the living room, repairing the hems of wedding dresses and the knees of little boys' school pants. My afternoons are often spent in the garden, trimming my roses with care, coaxing each bloom to open as if it could forget the harsh winters that came before. People who meet me now see someone gentle. They notice my hands moving calmly over a piece of fabric, my voice soft when I greet them, the warm smell of coffee always drifting from my kitchen. They would never guess these hands once shook uncontrollably as they tried to protect me from things I could not name. They would never imagine my voice once disappeared completely because speaking felt dangerous. I have learned to wear peace on the outside, even when I know how heavy the scars are beneath it. Back then, in the house where I grew up, life seemed perfectly ordinary to anyone looking in from the outside. My father was a truck driver who spent long days on the road. He was known as a man of his word, the kind of neighbor who would help push a broken-down car or shovel snow from someone else's driveway without being asked. My mother kept the house spotless, the laundry neatly folded, the meals served exactly on time. She was deeply involved in church and believed in appearances more than anything else. To her, the way the family looked to the outside world mattered more than what happened behind closed doors. Our home had a smell people always commented on. It was the mix of fresh laundry, lemon-scented polish, and the faint sweetness of cinnamon from the cookies my mother baked every Saturday. The front porch had 2 white chairs no one ever sat in, and the curtains in the living room were always perfectly aligned. We lived in a neighborhood where people noticed if you left your trash bins out too long or if the grass grew too high. Perfection was a silent agreement between everyone, and breaking it was unthinkable. As a little girl, I learned early how to stay inside that picture of perfection. I wore the dresses my mother ironed so sharply you could almost cut your finger on the crease. I kept my hair neatly braided and my shoes polished. I knew how to sit with my knees together, hands folded in my lap, and smile politely when spoken to. Compliments about how well behaved I was would light up my mother's face, and I knew that pleasing her meant keeping quiet about anything that might cause trouble. I remember afternoons when I would sit at the kitchen table, coloring in silence while my mother chatted on the phone with her friends. Her voice would rise with laughter when they talked about someone's child misbehaving, and she would shake her head, saying how lucky she was to have a daughter who never caused a scene. She did not know that my quietness was not luck, it was survival. The walls of that house held 1,000 unspoken rules. One of them was that family came before everything. That meant loyalty, obedience, and keeping secrets even if they hurt you. Another was that children did not question adults. The unspoken truth was that breaking these rules would bring shame, and shame was the one thing my mother could not bear. Her way of loving me was to keep me in line, to make sure I never brought her that shame. Even the smallest details of that house are burned into my memory. The way the floorboards creaked in the hallway, the cool feel of the bathroom tiles under my bare feet, the sound of the clock ticking in the living room. These were the everyday noises that masked the tension, the kind that you only notice when you are holding your breath and waiting for something to happen. When I think about my life back then, I can still feel the strange contrast between what the world saw and what I knew. To the neighbors, we were a model family. To the people at church, we were respectable and God-fearing. But inside those walls, I was learning that safety could be an illusion, that danger could live in the same house where the smell of fresh cookies filled the air. That contrast shaped everything in me. It taught me how to smile while hiding pain, how to appear calm when every nerve in my body was screaming. It also taught me to notice the smallest shifts in a room, the way someone's tone changes mid-sentence, the pause between footsteps, the flicker of a look that lasts a little too long. These were the signals that told me when it was time to disappear, when it was time to become invisible in my own home. Years later, when people ask me how I became so good at reading others, I tell them it is just something I picked up over time. What I do not tell them is that I learned it because my safety depended on it. I learned to listen not just to words but to the silences between them. I learned to watch hands as much as eyes. I learned that a smile can hide anything if you hold it long enough. Even now, as I sit in my quiet little home, with the sound of the sewing machine humming in the background, those lessons are still with me. They are stitched into me just as tightly as the seams I sew, invisible to anyone else, but impossible for me to undo. The woman I am now was built on those early years, shaped by that perfect-looking house and the rules that kept its secrets locked inside. Back then, my family was the kind people in town admired. My father spent long weeks driving his truck across state lines, bringing home the kind of steady paycheck that kept the lights on in the pantry full. People respected him. They would nod at him in the diner, shake his hand at church, and speak of him as a man who worked hard and took care of his own. My mother stayed home, and her devotion to keeping the house in perfect order was unmatched. She ironed every shirt until it looked brand new and scrubbed the floors until they shined. She was deeply rooted in our church community, quick to offer a pie for a bake sale or volunteer for Sunday school. In public, we were the picture of a well-grounded American family. It was in this environment that my uncle began to appear more often. He was my father's younger brother, single and always drifting between jobs. He had an easy way about him that made people like him almost immediately. He told funny stories that made my father laugh and my mother smile in a way I rarely saw. He brought me small gifts, a box of crayons, a hair ribbon, once even a little silver bracelet that was far too big for my wrist. At first, I thought of him as exciting, someone who could turn an ordinary evening into something special with just his presence. But over time, his attention began to change. It was not the kind of shift a child could fully understand, but I felt it all the same. The way his eyes lingered on me a second too long, the way his hand would rest on my shoulder even when there was no reason for it. At family dinners, he would sit close and his knee would brush against mine under the table. It might have seemed like nothing to an outsider, but to me it was something I felt in my stomach, an uneasy twist I could not put into words. I started noticing patterns. He would find reasons to be alone with me. If my father stepped out to take a phone call, my uncle would suddenly remember something he wanted to show me in the garage or downstairs. My mother never questioned it. She trusted him completely. He was family. That word had a kind of power in our house, a shield that excused almost anything. I learned quickly that saying no to a request from family was considered rude, even disrespectful. The first time I remember feeling truly trapped was on an afternoon when my father was away on a long haul. My mother was upstairs folding laundry, humming to herself. My uncle called me into the basement to help him look for a toolbox. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, but he smiled, told me I was his best helper. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe I was safe. The basement smelled of oil and dust. There was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and move with every flicker. He closed the door behind us, and the sound of it latching was sharper than usual. He walked ahead of me, his boots thudding against the concrete. I tried to keep my eyes on the shelves lined with jars and boxes, but I could feel his attention shift toward me. His voice was different, lower, slower. He handed me a wrench, and his hand lingered too long on mine. My stomach knotted. I did not know what to do except stay quiet. I remember every detail of that moment. The rough texture of the wrench handle against my palm, the hum of the freezer in the corner, the faint sound of the washing machine upstairs, muffled by the thick walls. My mind grabbed onto those sounds and textures like they were anchors, something to focus on so I would not have to think about what was happening. It was not an explosion of violence, not that first time. It was a series of small intrusions, so carefully measured that if I told anyone, they could be dismissed as nothing. A hand too close to my waist, fingers brushing the back of my neck, words that sounded like compliments but made my skin crawl. It was in those moments that I began to understand a truth I would carry for years. Danger did not always arrive with loud footsteps or a raised voice. Sometimes it came quietly, smiling, pretending to care. I learned to read the air when he was around. If his mood was playful, I stayed still and polite. If his mood was sharp, I found excuses to leave the room. I started memorizing the layout of the house in a new way, mapping out which doors locked and which did not, where the windows opened easily and where they stuck. I was only a child, but my mind was already building escape plans I could never fully use. These first signs, these quiet moments of wrongness, became part of my everyday life. They were like the background noise of my childhood, present even when I tried to focus on school or friends. I did not tell my mother. Deep down, I already knew what she would say. He was family. I must have misunderstood. And in our house, misunderstanding was my fault. It was in this space, between knowing and pretending not to know, that my childhood began to shift. The smiles at the dinner table, the laughter at church, the carefully ironed dresses all remained. But beneath them, something darker had taken root, growing quietly, waiting for the moments when no one else was watching. It stopped being subtle. Whatever small restraint he had in those early days disappeared, replaced by a boldness that left no room for doubt. The moments I used to dread came more often now, and there was no mistaking his intent. He no longer needed an excuse to be near me. The sound of the basement door closing, the click of a lock, or even just his shadow passing in the hallway was enough to make my stomach turn. The basement had become more than a room. It was a place where time seemed to stretch until minutes felt like hours. The air was always cold down there, heavy with the smell of damp cement and rust. There was no window, no escape, and no one to hear anything. He knew this. That was the point. I would stare at the bare bulb above us, trying to lose myself in the small circle of light it threw, as if focusing on that glow could block out everything else. Sometimes the bulb would flicker, and I would imagine it going out completely, leaving us in total darkness. A part of me thought maybe the dark would make me invisible. My mother never questioned the time I spent alone with him. If anything, she seemed grateful that he kept me busy. If I tried to resist, her expression would tighten and her voice would take on that sharp warning tone that made it clear I was the problem. She would remind me that family looks out for each other, that my uncle loved me, and that I needed to be polite. Her words were a shield for him, and I learned very quickly that going against her would not just make things worse with him, it would make things worse with her. The threats he whispered were not the kind you could repeat. They were crafted to stick under your skin, to live in the quiet spaces of your mind where they could keep working long after the words had been spoken. He would tell me no one would believe me, that I would be the one to ruin the family, that my father would leave if he ever found out. Sometimes he would change his tone, speaking as if he was doing me a favor, as if I should be grateful for his attention. That shift was almost worse than the threats, because it made me question myself. There were moments when I thought about telling someone, but the fear of what would follow always pulled me back. At school, I would sit in class, staring at the chalkboard while the teacher explained something I could barely hear. My mind was elsewhere, calculating how to move through the rest of the day without drawing attention. I learned how to make myself small, how to blend into the background so well that people's eyes slid right past me. He began to invade spaces that had once been safe. The kitchen when my mother stepped out to check the mail. The living room when the television was too loud for anyone to hear. Even my bedroom, the one place I had always believed belonged to me, was no longer mine. I would wake to find him standing in the doorway or sitting at the edge of my bed. The sound of his breathing in the dark was enough to make my heart race until it hurt. I stopped inviting friends over. The risk was too high. What if he found a way to be alone with them too? I could not let anyone else carry this weight, so I withdrew completely. My world shrank to the walls of our house, and inside those walls I learned to exist in silence. The phone would ring, and I would let it go unanswered. The doorbell would chime, and I would stay upstairs, pretending I had not heard. The isolation made his control stronger. Without anyone to confide in, I became trapped in my own thoughts. Nights were the worst. The quiet of the house would settle over me like a heavy blanket, every creak and sigh of the old wood magnified in the dark. Sometimes I would lie awake for hours, listening for his footsteps, trying to guess if he was awake, if he was coming. My body stayed tense, even in sleep. Looking back now, I understand that this wasn't just about the things he did. It was about the way he rewired my mind. He made me doubt my instincts, made me question my own memories. He used silence as a weapon, filling it with the weight of what could happen at any moment. And he was never alone in that control. My mother's willingness to look away, to protect the image of our family above all else, gave him every opportunity he needed. The house itself began to feel different to me. It was no longer the place where I had colored at the kitchen table or watched cartoons on Saturday mornings. It was a maze of traps. Every hallway, every closed door, every shadow held the possibility of him. Even the sound of the refrigerator humming or the wind against the windows could set off a rush of anxiety. The ordinary had been turned into a series of alarms only I could hear. In those days, there were no signs for outsiders to read. He knew how to smile when other people were around, how to make jokes that made the room laugh, and I knew how to smile back, how to keep my voice steady, how to look like a girl with nothing to hide. I became skilled at wearing that mask, but underneath it the fear was constant, and the silence that kept it hidden was the same silence that kept me trapped. I do not know if it was my trembling hands or the way my eyes seemed to avoid everyone's gaze that caught her attention first, but one afternoon, my teacher kept me behind after class. The other children ran outside into the crisp fall air, their laughter echoing down the hallway, while I stayed at my desk, clutching my books tightly to my chest. She did not ask me to sit. She just stood there, close enough that I could feel her presence, but not so close that I felt cornered. Her voice was gentle when she asked if everything was all right at home. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I had trained myself too well. The words stayed trapped in my throat, my lips pressed into a thin line. I told her I was fine, but even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. For the next few weeks, she found small reasons to speak to me alone. Sometimes she asked about homework, sometimes about a book I was reading. Other times she said nothing at all, just looked at me in a way that felt like she was trying to read the spaces between my words. It was strange to feel someone's eyes searching not for what you said, but for what you could not say. Part of me wanted her to stop. Another part of me wanted her to keep going, to pull the truth out of me without making me say it. At home, nothing changed. My uncle was as present as ever, my mother as oblivious or unwilling as always. The house felt heavier with each day. I started carrying that heaviness to school, wearing it like an invisible coat. It made my steps slower, my voice quieter, my smile almost non-existent. I think that is what finally convinced her that something was deeply wrong. She stopped asking if I was all right. Instead, one afternoon, she simply said, "I'm here if you need me." Those words did not sound like a question. They sounded like a door opening, even if I was too afraid to walk through it. The first time I tried to tell her, my voice was barely a whisper. We were in the library during recess, the smell of old paper thick in the air. I was pretending to look at a book when she asked if I wanted to talk. I remember my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles went white. I wanted to tell her everything, but the fear was overwhelming. I managed a few broken sentences, fragments that hinted at the truth but fell far short of it. She did not push. She just nodded and told me it was okay to take my time. That patience was something I had never experienced from an adult before. Over the next few days, my thoughts became a storm. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the words I could say and the ones I could not. I imagined her face when she heard the truth. Would she believe me? Would she think I was lying like I feared everyone else would? Would she call my mother? That thought made my stomach turn because I knew what my mother's reaction would be. I had seen it before in smaller moments. The anger, the shame, the way she would turn it all back on me. The breaking point came on a grey Thursday afternoon. It had been raining since morning, the windows streaked with water, the playground outside a mess of puddles. My uncle had been at the house the night before, and the weight of it was crushing me. My teacher asked if I could help her carry some papers to the storage room at the end of the hall. It was quiet there, the hum of the fluorescent light the only sound. She turned to me and said, "You look like you are carrying something too heavy for someone your age." It was such a simple sentence, but it cracked something inside me. The words spilled out before I could stop them. My voice was shaking, my chest tight, my breath coming fast. I did not tell her everything, not yet, but I told her enough. Enough for her eyes to change, for her to kneel down so we were at the same level, for her to put a hand on the table and say, "I believe you." That was the moment I realized how long I had been waiting to hear those words. From there, things moved in a way that felt both slow and terrifyingly fast. She told me I had done the right thing. She promised I would not have to handle this alone. She spoke in a calm, steady voice, as if she knew I was ready to run at any second. I did not understand what would happen next, but for the first time, I felt the smallest spark of something I had not felt in years. It was not relief, not yet. It was the faintest possibility of escape. When the school counselor joined us later that day, I was too drained to repeat much. My teacher stayed in the room, her presence like a barrier against the fear that threatened to swallow me again. I watched the rain running down the window behind the counselor's desk, tracing lines across the glass like the map of an unfamiliar road. I did not know where it led. I only knew I was finally moving. What followed was a blur, the kind of sequence you remember not as a straight line, but as scattered fragments. I remember the voices first. Some were loud, sharp, accusing. Others were quiet, almost too quiet, as if speaking in hushed tones could make the truth disappear. I remember police officers in our living room, their radios crackling softly at their belts. I remember my mother's face, pale and rigid, her lips pressed into that thin, disapproving line I knew so well. She avoided my eyes, as if looking at me might force her to acknowledge what she had refused to see for so long. They took me from the house that day. The decision was quick, but the weight of it felt enormous. I was given a small duffel bag with only a few clothes hastily packed inside. There was no time to choose what to bring. The officers walked me out the front door, past the white chairs on the porch that had always been more decoration than comfort. I remember glancing back just once. The curtains in the living room were drawn, and for a moment I imagined that the house itself was relieved to see me go. The days that followed were a mix of confusion and relief. I stayed with a family I barely knew, distant relatives who offered me a guest room with a floral quilt and a lamp that clicked loudly when you turned it on. They were kind, but kindness felt strange after so many years of walking on eggshells. I kept waiting for it to be taken away, for the rules to shift without warning, but the house stayed warm. The voices stayed calm. There were no locked basement doors here. The investigation moved forward, and with it came the cold reality of hearing my story told in other people's words. Social workers, police officers, lawyers, they all spoke about me as if I were not in the room. I learned to listen without reacting, to hold my breath when they discussed details I wished I could forget. My uncle's name was said more times than I could count, each repetition hitting me like a stone. Some nights, I would sit at the small desk in my room and stare at the wall, thinking about the life I had left behind, not because I missed it, but because it felt strange to be outside of it. I had been trapped in that house for so long that even freedom felt unfamiliar. The quiet in my new room was different. It was not the tense silence of waiting for footsteps on the stairs. It was the peaceful kind, the kind that allowed you to unclench your fists without realizing you had been holding them tight. There were moments when the guilt tried to creep in, whispering that I had destroyed the family, that I had brought shame to my mother. But I began to understand something I had not been allowed to see before. Speaking the truth was not the shame. The shame was in the years of silence, in the people who knew something was wrong and chose to look away. That realization did not erase the pain. but it gave me the strength to stand a little taller. In the months that followed, I began to build a new version of myself. I went back to school. I started making friends cautiously, testing the waters to see who felt safe. I learned to laugh again, though at first it felt foreign in my own mouth. The nightmares came less often, and when they did, I found ways to calm myself. I began keeping a small notebook, writing down things I wanted to remember, moments of safety, kindness, and courage, so that I could remind myself that they existed. Years have passed since then, and the girl who lived in that house is gone. I am not the same person who kept her head down and her voice quiet to survive. I am someone who knows the value of speaking, even when your voice trembles. I am someone who understands that survival is not just about enduring the pain, but about refusing to let it define you forever. When I look back now, I do not see only the basement, the locked doors, or the silence. I see the teacher who noticed. I see the moment I heard the words, "I believe you." I see the first night I slept without fear of footsteps in the dark. These moments are the threads I hold onto, weaving them into a life that is no longer defined by what was taken from me, but by what I have reclaimed. If you are listening to this, and you have your own locked doors, your own unspoken truths, I want you to know that you are not alone. There is a world outside of that silence, and it is waiting for you. The path may be messy and frightening, but every step you take toward the truth is a step away from the darkness. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Your presence here means that voices like mine are heard, that they matter, and that they will not be forgotten. If you found strength in these words, let them guide you toward the next story, the next truth waiting to be told. The next chapter is right here on your screen, and I hope you will join me there, because some stories are too important to be left untold.